We're not crazy, the system is. Tune in to Madness Radio, voices and visions from outside mental health. Wednesdays, 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time on Pacifica affiliate WXOJLP-FM 103.3 Valley Free Radio. Produced by Freedom Center and the Icarus Project, streaming live, podcasting, and archived at madnessradio.net. Thanks for tuning in to Madness Radio. I'm your host, Will Hall, and I'm actually doing the broadcast today from pre-recorded broadcast from Buenos Aires, Argentina. And actually, we're not talking about Argentina on the show today. That was actually last week's show. You can check that out. But today we have Bruce Levine. Bruce has been on Madness Radio in the past, and he's just come out with a new book, and the title is Surviving America's Depression Epidemic: How to Find Morale, Energy, and Community in a World Gone Crazy. So the description of the book is the rate of depression in the U.S. has increased more than tenfold in the last 50 years. By not seriously confronting societal sources of despair, American mental health institutions have become part of the problem rather than the solution. The good news is that age-old wisdom and legitimate science, uncorrupted by the profit margin pressures of pharmaceutical and insurance corporations, have much to inform us about revitalizing depressed people and a depressing culture. Surviving America's Depression Epidemic provides an alternate approach that encompasses the whole of our humanity, society, and culture, and which redefines depression in a way that makes enduring transformation more likely. So I highly recommend this book. Check it out. Get it from your independent bookstore. And if you're in the Northampton area, check the Freedom Center website, freedom-center.org, because Bruce Levine is coming into town soon. He's going to be doing an event sponsored by the Freedom Center. So let me read Bruce's bio as well. Bruce E. Levine, Ph.D., is a clinical psychologist, author of Surviving America's Depression Epidemic: How to Find Morale, Energy, and Community in a World Gone Crazy, published by Chelsea Green this year, 2007. Dr. Levine has been in private practice since 1985. He is also the author of Common Sense Rebellion: Taking Back Your Life from Drugs, Shrinks, Corporations, and a World Gone Crazy, Continuum, 2003. Dr. Levine has been a regular contributor to Z Magazine and the Huffington Post, and his articles and interviews have been published in Adbusters, The Ecologist, and numerous other magazines. Dr. Levine is on the advisory council of the International Center for the Study of Psychiatry and Psychology, and on the editorial advisory board of the journal Ethical Human Psychology and Psychiatry. His website is brucelevine.net. I should also say that Bruce is on the editorial advisory board of the new publication that Freedom Center and the Icarus Project have just released, which is the Harm Reduction Guide to Coming Off Psychiatric Drugs. So welcome to Madness Radio, Bruce Levine.
Good to be on again, Will.
Yeah, so congratulations on your new book. How is it being received? How are the reviews? What is the public? What is the readership responding like?
Well, it's being received very well. We've got a lot of reviews from all different kind of walks of life. We've got certainly some dissenting psychiatrists who've said some really positive things about it, like that you would expect. Folks like Grace Jackson and Stuart Shipka, and we've also got, some great endorsements from psychiatric survivors like yourself and David Oakes, who gave me a great endorsement. But we also got some other interesting endorsements from people from clergy and from also some significant political figures, and that's really where it's kind of the target audiences for it are like actually a few. For certainly, the one target audience are people who have been failed by the mental health profession. Either themselves personally or their friends, that they found it to be non-productive or in many cases counterproductive. But there's also another audience who aren't in that group, who really this book was for people who just feel increasingly alienated from the society and the culture, sort of extremist consumer culture, extremist industrialism, whatever you would want to call it, and people who are realizing at some level that by not acknowledging that extra amount of pain that's caused by a sort of society that's going crazy, that psychiatry, psychology, the whole mental health professionals in many ways become part of the problem rather than the solution.
Bruce, that's really exciting to me because I really think that that's where this whole mental health movement has got to go. We've got to start making connections with the broader society, and I think that there are some kind of parallels with the way in which feminism and the environmental movements kind of started as sort of special interest movements and now have become just part of how everybody talks about the society. I mean, these discussions are going on in general throughout the society. So it's really exciting for me to hear that political figures and clergy are interested in the book and
Yeah,
supporting
one
the
of the
book.
probably one of the most well-known political figures. I mean, not super well-known, but in many circles, is someone named Arianna Huffington. I don't know how many folks in your of your listeners have heard of her, but she's started the Huffington Post and is one of those more familiar talking heads on television. And she's one of the few people who are in that, whatever you want to call it, liberal progressive movement, who's critically thinking enough to understand that, to get it early on, that the mental health has now been sort of hijacked by corporations, and you have something akin to the military-industrial complex, which has very little to do with protecting and defending the United States, and that's what's happened to the almost an equivalent U.S. Psychopharmaceutical industrial complex, which I just have an article out in November Z magazine with that title. And so more and more people are getting that, and I think the good news for the long-time struggling psychiatric survivors who want the people to know this is that one of the things that happens, I think, historically, is when you have a kind of expansionistic or imperialistic or whatever terms that you want to use, a sort of a greedy organization that just wants to control everything, that eventually they go too far and they make themselves kind of laughable even for the mainstream. And so this year especially, you'll see that the New York Times, which has really been very slow, just as they were in terms of criticizing the Bush administration, and many other powerful institutions, they finally, this year and the last couple of years more so, have seen that psychiatry has gotten so ridiculous, where you have 40-fold increases in bipolar disorder for kids in the last 10 years, and you see huge corruption by pharmaceutical companies of particular psychiatrists on Medicaid state boards. It's gotten to the point where they've gone so far that even your more mainstream, whatever you want to call it, corporate media is now criticizing it. So it's really a great time for me. My publisher was thrilled about the timing of this book because they're always wanting to have as huge an audience as possible. Of course, we want psychiatric survivors to read it because they'll learn some things from it, but some of the things that are in the book they already know. But for the more mainstream audience out there, it's certainly a bridge to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I really think that your work is some of the most cutting edge work that's going on, in the way that the connections are being made, and this really is much broader than just a kind of narrow interest around mental health. It's really about how we live as a society and how we relate as a community, and the way in which community has been taken apart, which is really what the book is about. I really love the phrase, the idea of demoralization, and how do we bring morale back into our communities and back into our lives. But let's get right into the book here, and I kind of want to start because I mean there may be people listening who just kind of say to themselves, well, look, depression is, when I'm depressed, or my friends are depressed, people I know they're depressed, it's just such a physical thing. I mean, clearly it's a biochemical imbalance. It's something probably genetic. It's probably some kind of chemical thing going on in the brain, and you just have to take medication. So I know you talk about this a lot and you debunk this. Can you just give us an explanation of why that perspective really doesn't hold up?
Well, first of all, I think might surprise a lot of people out there who, if all you've ever done is watch these antidepressant commercials on television, or for doctors out there who all they ever do is get their information from sales representatives from drug companies, which unfortunately is too much, most of them. But it might surprise those people to find out that actually the psychiatric establishment, the psychiatric officialdom, thinks National Institute of Mental Health, the director recently came out and said in Newsweek in the cover story this year, spring. It was actually spring this year. Something called "Men in Depression" was the story, and he said, "Look, we know no depression isn't caused by any kind of serotonin deficiency, and that in fact they've moved on to other theories that and he said specifically depression is not caused by an underproduction of anything." Well, it was shocking for a lot of people, but I tell folks, if you look back 10 years, already in 1998, the American Medical Association's Essential Guide to Depression said specifically levels of serotonin aren't related to depression. People have high levels of serotonin, get depressed, low levels. And this is based on a lot of studies that were going on in the early 1990s that tested this. There were studies that looked at serotonin and other neurotransmitter metabolites in people's spinal fluids. There was other studies that were done on they called them serotonin or epinephrine depletion studies, and took a look what happened if you depleted serotonin in people. Did that create more depression? And so there's lots of studies, and actually by 2002, the New York Times, in a review of all this, they said, this is an exact quote. They said, in relation to these serotonin or all these neurotransmitter deficiency theories, they said a multitude of studies fails to prove this precept, and all this is documented and referenced in Surviving America's Depression Epidemic.
Yeah, and of course that just goes against the marketing, which is the antidepressants were basically marketed as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So the idea is you need more serotonin, and here you go. Now, how do the drugs work then? Because I know that the
Well,
placebo
that's a
effect.
great point what you're saying. It is purely marketing, not science, because they knew very well that if the drugs, for those people out there who these drugs, they experience it as working. And certainly if you take a look at studies, depending on the research design, somewhere between 25 and 35%, of people when they take these, when they're in these studies, will have some kind of positive or even remission of symptoms when they're taking these drugs. But how do these drugs work? Well, a couple of ways. One is purely through the placebo effect. And most of these studies that you took a look at, in fact, we have major research that shows in the majority of studies these drugs fail to outperform the placebo. So in other words, for people, if they have high expectations of anything working, it's going to work. We know that. And that's just a common principle in science. And the second way that they work is that for some people, not all people, but some people, they really do, like any other psychotropic drug and drugs that affect neurotransmitters, they experience them as taking the edge off, just like people who use illegal drugs experience that. Now, for many other people, that doesn't take the edge off. They get agitated, and it's very unpredictable. Whether you use alcohol or illegal drugs or psychiatric drugs, all these drugs affect neurotransmitters, and you can't say for sure whether a drug is going to make you more edgy or it's going to take the edge off. A lot of it has to do with expectations, but there are other variables. So that's how it really works. Of course, the pharmaceutical companies know that would be not well. You don't want to market a drug to make it sound like it works the way an illegal drug works or a placebo. Exactly. So the way to market a drug is to convince everybody that they are depressed because they have this deficiency of serotonin. But if you listen real closely to those commercials, they never say it. They always say maybe or thought to be. Those are the phrases they use because they know it hasn't been proved, and in fact disproved that people have that deficiency. So just like if they want people to think about it like it's like diabetes, that people who have diabetes have a deficiency of insulin, therefore they need to take insulin to be able to restore this imbalance. That's what they want to have in people's heads because that's going to sell drugs.
Although, as a friend of mine pointed out, they no longer use the diabetes metaphor so much because Zyprexa, the antipsychotic drug, has been linked to causing diabetes.
Yeah, right.
So they have to come up with a different one. And I think, Bruce, that the point about the placebo effect is really important because in a lot of ways we live in a placebo society. We are completely saturated with media images that are manipulating our expectations when we buy products. So when you take a antidepressant, when I took Prozac, for example, I was being completely bombarded with all of these messages that are creating the expectations, planting those messages in deep inside of my mind, and then that affects how I experience them. And of course, as we know with illegal drugs or recreational drugs, so much of it depends on the person. Some people take cocaine and they enjoy it. Other people have a very negative experience. It's often about the counterculture, the society that you're in, what your friends are doing, the peer pressure, all these different experiences. But of course, the placebo effect isn't something you can really sell. So they want to sell something that claims to have hard science when it doesn't. One of the other questions I had for you is just this whole thing about like depression, because I know for me, it's not really a word that I use very much because my experience is so much more detailed than that. I can have times when I'm just really feel like I'm blocked. My anger is really blocked and I'll be depressed. There's other times when I feel sad when that's about depression. There's times when I'll be like have left my body and I'll be very dissociated, and then that's kind of like depression. And so when we talk about this word depression, we're not talking about a clear clinical entity that has a biological aspect to it. We're really talking about a very personal individual experience that can be very different for different people, or even different for the same person, depending on what kind of depression you're going through in the moment.
Well, I agree, and there's a lot of points off of what you're saying there. One is if you read memoirs or biographies about depressed people, almost all of, especially literary type people, hate that word, depression. I mean, they even like melancholy better. Almost nobody really likes that word. Who, from my point of view, who are like more kind of aesthetically minded or critical thinkers. They even like. I tend to like the word demoralization because it leads me somewhere more. If I'm demoralized, I know, hey, I need to kind of get my morale back, and depression is not something that really helps me very much as a word. But the word, I mean, it's interesting for me if you want to use depression, what it really is. I mean, it is when people are overwhelmed by pain, overwhelming pain, human beings, all of us, that's all of us, we use strategies to kind of shut down that pain sometimes. And sometimes if we do this temporarily or not, we're not habituated to them, they're effective. It helps us survive. And what happens to all of our shutdown strategies, whether we're using alcohol or marijuana or watching television, too much, these can get out of hand. And so what happens is that from my experience, and this is sort of the link with Western society and consumer culture, industrialized society, one of the things that happens in our society that makes this depression worse is that we're already kind of using some kind of shutdown or depressing mechanism to deal with our overwhelming pain, but when that goes too far and we become immobilized, and that's what I'm really most interested in, not just this light, light sadness and people a little bit miserable, but I mean people really immobilized. What happens to them is that, when they get in that state, it's not a motivator for them to act. What happens is that's terrifying in this culture to be immobilized, to lose your job, not have enough energy to get another one. That's terrifying. And what is fear but another pain? And so psychologically, often people will, even though it's not in their own best interest, they will use their shutdown mechanism again to kind of shut down that pain, that fear of pain. And so you see this vicious cycle. And a big part of why I wrote Surviving America's Depression Epidemic was to deal with that vicious cycle and to talk about the craft, and it's really a craft, not so much a science, of how people can help themselves and help each other kind of pull out of that vicious cycle.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that we use the phrase non-functioning, people who are non-functioning, that being a productive citizen is really kind of the key thing. And depression is really something that can directly threaten your livelihood, and it's very terrifying. And I think at the deeper ends of depression is the whole question of suicide. And what would you say to the argument that some people make that, well, look, antidepressant drugs, they help prevent suicides, and so they're good because so many people, the suicides rates have gone down since people have started using antidepressant drugs. Is that true, or what would you say to that?
Well, it's just not true. I mean, when you do look at the literature, and again, I have this all documented in Surviving America's Depression Epidemic, that I've articles just from the British Medical Journal that goes by BMJ, that they've looked at this issue, and other people have as well, and it doesn't reduce suicide in the use of antidepressants. And in fact, the studies, more recent studies that show, at least in people under 25, is that it increases, almost doubles the possibility of people thinking about suicide or making suicide attempts. So, this idea that what's happened, I think maybe what you're referring to is this recent article in the American Journal of Psychiatry where they claimed that suicide rates are going up, because antidepressant prescriptions are going down, and this got a lot of news. But a lot of them, again, the mainstream press, including the New York Times, caught them in a basic lie, which was that the antidepressant prescriptions didn't start going down till 2005, and there was no data at all on suicide from the CDC for that year. And so they were using 2004 data, and in 2004, their data, there was no association, that they were talking about. But even if in 2005 suicide rates did happen to continue to go up, I think mostly if you take a look at historically what homicide, suicide, rates always mostly have to do with economic variables. And so it was even before I discovered that they were being untruthful about the actual facts, I thought it was pretty problematic for them to be claiming what every good scientist knows, that association isn't causation, and that the usual and historically the reasons that affect suicide and homicide doesn't have anything to do with psychiatric treatments, getting it or not getting it. It usually has to do, like I say, economic conditions.
Yeah, the pharmaceutical industry is waging a really serious propaganda campaign, and they took a big hit when the black box warnings were put on the antidepressant drugs, saying, "Look, these drugs can increase suicide," and they're trying to argue that, well, now that fewer people are using these drugs, there's more suicide, so we have to be cautious about telling people to not use these drugs because they have these the side effects. It's really a propaganda argument that's being made. So, Bruce, you talked about economic variables. So, what, in your view, is the causes of depression, or are the causes of depression? And the other question I had for you is is it true that there is this epidemic? Because I know that there is a diagnosis inflation, that psychiatry and the pill companies want more and more people to get diagnoses, and they want more people to be told, yes, you have this disorder, so that they will be able to market their drugs. But is there actually a depression epidemic going on in the U.S. and even worldwide? And then what would be the causes of it if it's not this biochemical cause that's claimed by the mainstream?
Well, let me take the first part of your question, is that, and let me make sure I get to the second part if I forget it. But in the first part, what you're talking about is what do we know are the causes of depression? Well, we certainly know what's associated with depression, and the obvious things that people in your audience who've retained their common sense are not going to be surprised. But we have many studies that show, for example, social isolation is associated with depression. Miserable marriages are associated with depression. We also know economically, people who are on public assistance, who are on welfare, at least in the United States, their rates of depression are triple the general population. Again, because it's, if your whole society is poor around you, it's not as lethal if you're poor. But if everybody around you, or some people around you, have wealth and you don't, it's much more painful. And we also know in the U.S. that people who are unemployed, their rates of depression are almost twice as high as people who aren't depressed. And we know people who've had early childhood trauma. There's over 200 studies that show that those folks are in some studies as high 12 times as likely to become depressed. And so the common thread in all of these associations are pain, is emotional pain. Now, again, if you're a real scientist, you will say, like, well, does depression, does a lack of community, a lack of social support lead to depression, or does depression, make one less, likely to go out and make friends? And certainly, there's these vicious cycles, these vicious interactional cycles that one has to take seriously. But in one interesting study where they talked to unhappily married women, and they asked them, what do you think the cause of their depression was? And the majority of them said, my unhappy marriage, which I'm sure their depression didn't make that marriage any happier. So again, there's a vicious cycle. But your other point about the inflation of the amount of people being depressed, do we really have a huge increase in the rate of depression? I think it's a sort of difficult question to sort out. From looking at all the data and from my experience, I would say that the huge increases in tenfold, maybe even higher than that increase in the rate of depression in the last 50 years in the U.S. has to do with a couple of things. One is I think that people are more and more aware of these symptoms of depression from these antidepressant commercials, and they're more and more when they go in their doctor, and the doctor can't figure out what's wrong with them. They immediately call them depressed, and what might be just a passing state that might just be a few weeks all of a sudden becomes a permanent condition. All of a sudden, not only do they have an illness, they become a depressive for life. So certainly some of that happens, but I also think it's a mistake that some critics of psychiatry make to pin it all on that really, that and not taking a look that I think there is a great deal more despair and unnecessary pain that's created by society and culture that is, in fact, increasing levels of unhappiness.
Bruce, what about I mean, this is something we talk about a lot at the Freedom Center and the Icarus Project, just the role of holistic health perspectives, like, for example, the way in which diet can play a role in depression and anxiety. And I know that for me, I mean, one of the ways that I kind of manage my own experiences with depression, certainly it's community and being connected with people and having that morale and being excited and interested in the world. But I also have to be really careful about the foods that I eat and really careful about my personal health of my body from a holistic perspective. What do you think about that?
Well, sir, again, this is common sense, but we have lots of studies to bear out that to the extent that somebody's physical health is good, their mental health is going to be good, and to the extent that you go through some severe physical problems, whether it's anemia or whether it's your food allergy, that you're going to be more likely to be miserable because again, that's pain. And so, to say that there isn't an underlying biochemical source of depression is very different than saying that certain problematic medical conditions or physical conditions are they're, of course they're associated with depression. So what I always tell folks is that you really, you want to really pay attention to your own body, really pay attention to what things, what foods that you eat or don't, that make you feel bad. And some people are highly, their day can be ruined by having some MSG the night before. And for other people, it's no big deal to have that. And so, really paying attention to your body and what feels good and what helps you, get proper sleep. All of those things are huge.
Well, yeah, I want to get into this kind of the positive solutions and the strategies that you're presenting. But you said something earlier that I think was kind of really provocative. The example of someone who is depressed, and then if you ask them why, they say, "Well, my marriage is the cause of my depression." And then of course the system sort of offers antidepressant drugs. So in a sense, would you say that pushing pills and the kind of the medicalization of these problems is really a form of social control? It's a way of kind of keeping the status quo out of the discussion and saying, well, the problem is with the individual, it's inside of you.
Yeah, I think two things are going on. Obviously, the major reason why all the pill pushing is happening is just easy money for drug companies and easy money for doctors. That's the easiest. Rather than talking to folks. I mean, so on one level, that's what's happening. But the reason why it stays, why there's no forces in society, major institutional forces that have seriously confronted it, is because exactly what you're saying. It does maintain the status quo, and one of the most obvious sources of depression is the interpersonal realm. I mean, because what can be one of the most major reasons besides your physical health that creates pain for you is your interpersonal relationships, either total loneliness, which is painful, or being in a miserable relationships. And so often you'll see people in family life where for whatever reason there's enormous resentment that's built up, anger, feelings people are being uncared about, and that there's nothing more painful than that, and so people move into depression off of that. So but that to start dealing with all the interpersonal elements of family life and society and the job world, I guess it sort of throws a monkey wrench into your efficient, productive assembly line, which doesn't want to deal with all those realities.
Yeah, you start talking about, well, how do we change the world, and what is wrong with the world, and what kind of maybe we need movements
Yeah,
and,
you start
and
talking about
activism.
maybe we need to have families spending a lot more time caring about interpersonal relationships than just thinking like you don't have to spend any time at all on that, and all your time should be spent on producing and consuming, which is basically what our culture is moving towards. They want people 24/7, actually doing both at the same time. I kind of joke about that in Surviving America's Depression Epidemic. It seems like your ideal person in our society is some salesman salesman in a car trying to sell something to somebody while they're using phone minutes eating fast food. So you want them to be doing selling, buying and consuming. And well, if you have a one-dimensional society where that's going on at the expense of, say, traditional peoples or pre-industrial peoples who spent a lot of time caring about human relationships, about language, about caring about having nobody in that tribe feeling any resentment. That was what they they prioritized, and we just don't do that in our society. And that, for me, as much as anything, is a huge reason why we have these huge increasing rates of misery, despair, and whatever depression or whatever you want to call it.
Bruce, do you think it's a matter of values and what people believe in and what they care about, or are there more powerful political, economic forces coming from corporate America and the financial system that are really driving this? Because I know that a lot of people certainly want to spend more time with their families and things, but they're just working so much, and there's so much pressure going on, and there's so much of an economic political force that's playing on individual lives. So how much of this is really about revitalizing values, and how much of it is challenging the political and economic status quo?
Well, I think the problem is that they're both interconnected, because if you don't buy into the values of the of the political status quo, for many people that's going to cause them to be economically marginalized. So people are pressured into accepting a certain kind of corporate industrial values, and that's painful. That goes back to the point I was making before. An enormous amount of reason why I wrote this book is for people who they may or may not be able to sort of articulate this, but as soon as I say that, it's highly, a lot of people feel really validated that a lot of their pain is caused by just feeling completely alienated from a society and culture whose values are being propagandized, controlled by corporations who want you to believe that for example, take schools, that it's like if you go there, get up 7 in the morning there, and you're there all day, and you're good and you're compliant, you're manageable, even if you didn't really learn anything, you did everything everybody told you to do, you were a good boy. A lot of those people become psychiatrists, psychologists, and they're not troubled by that. They're not pained by that. Whereas a lot of other people are going like, wait a minute, I thought school is supposed to be a place where they're supposed to kind of excite my learning here. They're supposed to get me more curious, and that's not happening here. And they're feeling alienated, and they're feeling pained by that. And so you have, I guess, to answer your question, it's that there is a battle going on here among people who are not buying into the value system that is being pushed on them by the economic order. And it's very, very difficult, because it's not just a kind of moral issue. To not buy in costs most people economically.
So how is it, you mentioned let's just sort of tie this all together. You mentioned that the rates of depression are going up. Depending on how you look at the statistics, they're basically going up. So what kinds of changes have been happening in our society on this level of the corporate economy and the way in which we're structured politically and economically? What kinds of changes have been driving this disintegration of community and the rise of alienation and the rise of depression?
Well, there's a lot of areas. The one that I could point to most statistically, some of these are very difficult to measure and quantify, but the one statistically that a lot of sociologists, probably most notably Robert Putnam in his book Bowling Alone, has talked about, is this huge decimation of community and social support. What he calls social capital is his term. That all that's happened in the last 50 years in the United States. So statistically, you could actually see people have fewer friends. They have less. They spend less time with the friends they do have. Same thing with coworkers or neighbors. And so how's that being driven? Why is that? What's going on that people have fewer friends? Of course, that something's going on in your whole kind of economic order of things, that people are being forced to move around a lot more than they did. You have eminent domain. This happens here where I'm living in Cincinnati, where major institutions decide they want to expand, so they just they just destroy neighborhoods. You have, obviously corporations destroying whole, towns by deciding that their profit margin isn't high enough, so taking their companies and taking their production to Mexico or some other, or to the Far East. So at many different levels, when you have a society that cares more only, actually exclusively, about money making, about bottom line, at the expense of every other variable, you're going to have a breakdown of community. So that's one huge area that you can actually statistically see. There are other areas as well, though.
Well, it makes me think of the studies that were done on immigrants and actually people coming to the United States from Mexico or other countries. If you measure their rates of mental health problems before they move to the U.S., they're lower. And then a generation later, they're having all these mental health problems just as a result of moving into the U.S.
Right. That's a famous study by William Vega that you're talking about that was done in the late about I think 1998. And yeah, with depression, the rate depression episodes has actually tripled to the extent that the Mexican immigrants were here for more than 13 years. And Vega talked to a lot of these folks in the study, and obviously a lot of Mexican immigrants came over here for money, for wealth, and they were thinking that that's they can get that and there would be no cost, and they all became clear to them that a huge reason why their rates, not just of depression, but substance abuse, you pick it. Why those all went up was that they just lost support for them, specifically family support, which was huge down there in Mexico. That it wasn't just your immediate family; it was cousins and aunts and uncles, and there was this huge support network that you just never felt terrified that if you were going through hard times, there would be someone to help you out. But when you come to this kind of this culture here, where it's like dog eat dog, survival of the fittest, there's this enormous terror that if you don't do what the boss tells you, you're out, and you could be homeless, and that's a pretty scary thing.
You mentioned the isolation and the fragmentation, people moving around, people losing friends. Do you think that also another driving factor in depression is just that kind of hopelessness for the future? I mean, we're living in a society where it's really hard to imagine what our grandchildren are going to be living in terms of the greenhouse effect, in terms of wars, in terms of the kind of technologies that are being unleashed, in terms of the way in which there are all these threats to our future, the environmental problems, toxic pollution, the effects that are happening on the food supply. I mean, do you think that plays a role in driving depression as well?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a totalitarian society or any kind of bunch of control freaks wants its population to be hopeless, because then they're going to not put up a fight. And so, in a lot of ways, that's what a lot of folks out there, their cynicism is understandable. I mean, I certainly get cynical on a very regular basis, and I certainly move into some degree of hopelessness. But then I realize, that's what folks who are controlling the whole show here. They'd like you to move on to those places, and so a lot of what I did for writing Surviving America's Depression Epidemic, I mean, certainly I looked at 30 years of empirical research on antidepressant treatments and on and on and on, all this kind of stuff. But a lot of what I also did was I was really interested in how people retain their morale, more subjective biographies, memoirs, essays, and some also was interested in even some pretty significant political figures who I sometimes scratch my head and I say, well, how have they been able to maintain their morale? So, for example, I did some reading on Noam Chomsky, and I said, how has this guy been able to just kind of stay fiercely, kind of vitalized and maintain his morale in the face of things? Because obviously, the guy's a super smart guy and he knows what's going on, but he keeps plugging away. And so,
people who don't know, Noam Chomsky is a very prominent left-wing critic of U.S. foreign policy and had been a big figure in the peace movement, is often very, very, very insightful, powerful critiques of American society and the power structure and everything. But you're right. It's very much about doom and gloom. It's very dark what he writes about.
yeah, what I was going to say, sorry, was that one of the interesting things that I've discovered with him, because most of what you read about him is just this fierce kind of critical analysis. But I was reading one sort of a question and answer period with him where somebody asked him, was talking to him basically, how do you maintain your morale? And he said, when I remember back in the early days of protesting the Vietnam War, and for people who may not realize it, but in the mid-1960s, 65, 1966, the vast majority of America was supporting this involvement in Vietnam, there was just a handful of people like Noam Chomsky and I don't know, a few others who were saying this is a ridiculous idea. And he talks about being at the time thinking like there's no chance. We're kind of wasting our time. This is sort of crazy. We're not going to accomplish anything. And then he in retrospect, obviously things in a couple of years things changed dramatically, and you have a huge part of America involved in the anti-war movement. And he looks back and he says, part of my problem was I was too much of an innocent. I was believing what I read in the papers about things here, and sort of being allowing myself to be convinced of the hopelessness of the situation by the media. And I do see this huge disconnect between what people at the very of the hierarchy, the mass media or the top of corporations sort of disseminate and want people to sort of believe about things, and what people are believing at a grassroots level. And part of what's really unfortunate now is, I think more than maybe almost any time in American history, people are just utterly broken and feel this sense of helplessness. But I think people at the top realize that their hold on things is very fragile, and it doesn't take much for people to get their morale back and do something about this.
Well, that's, I guess, what I wanted to ask you now is just about what would you recommend people who are experiencing depression or who have friends who are experiencing depression or who are struggling with this question? What are your recommendations? I mean, we can talk about changing the whole society, and we can certainly, talk about becoming activists and becoming involved with movements, but what kinds of things do you think people can do to boost their morale and kind of get themselves out of a depression phase if the mainstream approach of medications is not really the way that they want to go?
Well, at a very personal level, taking a look at that person who's just totally let's say there's somebody in your listening audience right now who's completely immobilized. They have just a hard time even getting out of bed. A lot of what I think they need to sort of focus in on is just basic morale, and think about who in their life kind of gives them energy, who in their life just sort of sucks any energy out of, just sucks energy away from them. For them to be thinking about if they're completely isolated and they have nobody to maybe think about at times in their life what they did do that just helped them get some morale. So I have a lot of vignettes in Surviving America's Depression book. I have a whole chapter on morale and energy, and talking about what people do, what this craft of regaining morale is all about, how people move out of this vicious cycle. And there's a lot of different ways, from humor to what I call a kind of a sort of a playful, good-hearted mischief. A lot of things out there don't take that much energy that can create positive energy, and a lot of things out there may feel like negative energy that can be transformed into sort of constructive energy. So a lot of artists I talk about who just feel utterly pained by things and just feel like they have no energy to do anything or to write anything, that they just kind of push themselves a little bit to be creative, and sometimes just doing that gives them some more energy. On another level, when people have some energy to do anything at all, one of the things that I think that happens when you're depressed, and this happens to me, is that we all get self-absorbed. And that, again, is a vicious cycle. And so part of what you want to try to do is that, that even if I believe that the world is coming to an end and there's nothing I could do about it, and that I just feel like we've got like 50 years left on the planet, and the heck with bothering any kind of social change or activism. And I think people need to understand that even if that were true, and I'm not saying that is true, but even if it were true, that it's in their best interest to kind of move beyond themselves and to see what other people are caring about, whether it's potholes on your street or it's some senseless war, and that energy of caring about something besides your own pain is going to be a vehicle that's going to help you connect with other people, and that connecting with other people becomes a huge kind of antidote to depression. Does that follow what I'm saying?
I think so. I mean, that's in my experience. I had a big personal lesson when I would get into very, very dark states where I would just feel like no one could understand me and people were trying to hurt me. And I just kind of learned that in these depressive states, if I could just call a friend and just to have them on the phone for a second and just to say, I'm calling you up, I feel awful, I can't really talk, but I figured it would be better for me to call you than to not. And then I would say goodbye. And actually I learned that just that little bit of reaching out and making contact when I was in those totally collapsed, can't get out of bed states really made a difference. It was a big personal lesson for me.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's sort of unavoidable, and this is a really hard thing to do when you're depressed and you have no energy, but is to remember that for a lot of the neat thing about a lot of people I know who become depressed is they tend to be sort of more sensitive to pain, and they can be even more like critical thinkers, and actually there's actually studies that prove that I talk about in the book. But there's upsides and downsides to every temperament. And if you're going to be more sensitive, you're going to be more critical thinker, you're going to probably have a lot more creative things to say, you're going to be a lot more interesting person, but you're more going to be more susceptible to feeling a lot of pain and malaise. And one of the things that you kind of need to learn at some point in your life is to have some discipline over those emotions, and you can, that discipline doesn't necessarily mean anything but having a sense of humor. I mean, for a lot of people, their way out, and very famous people, including Abraham Lincoln, who was he had two major suicide watches on him in his life. I mean, lots of major periods of despair. And what he discovered early in life was that humor was a kind of a discipline to kind of pull himself out of it. That it would not only pull himself out of these deep emotional states by allowing him not to take them so seriously, but it would also be very connecting. Other people kind of got a kick out of him, and also actually helped him politically. It was like one of his tools for success. So I know it's a hard thing to say to folks when they're completely down in the dumps, completely immobilized, where they're just looking for any kind of shot of energy, any shot of morale. But once they move a little bit past that, to understand that you do have to kind of create a little bit of discipline over those emotions and not get drowned by them.
So you would say that there is a connection between someone who maybe is more susceptible to depression or struggles with depression more in their life. There is a connection between that and creativity and sensitivity, you think?
Absolutely, and this is diametrically opposed to the modern psychiatric propaganda. In fact, Peter Kramer's just written a whole book in total opposition to that point. I mean, he's just equated depression to cancer, and says that what you just said there is just romantic hogwash. But common sense and my experience, and maybe and the research just backs up what you're saying. I mean, there's lots of studies out there that show, for example, that people who are more likely, people who are depressed are more likely to have some kind of critical thinking, to have a better sense what people really are thinking about them negatively, and to have a better sense. Studies show that they have a more of a sense of how much control they have over games. There's some famous studies in psychology that show that. We also have a huge history of a lot of artists and writers, and I talk about a lot of them in Surviving America's Depression Epidemic, who were deeply depressed, and their pain could have, some cases, fueled their total self-destructive behavior, but in other cases, some of these folks were lucky enough to discover that pain could also be a fuel for creativity, and so that's part of what I try to do, help folks to understand, is that if you're going to feel more out there, I mean, this seems basic common sense to me that I don't even need studies for, but there are, but that if you're going to feel things more deeply, you're going to feel more the absence of beauty in the world, you're going to feel more the absence, the lies of the world, you're going to feel the pain of those things more, you're going to be more sensitive to that, you're going to be more susceptible to depression, and therefore, if you don't want to give up your personality, which I suppose you can, you can completely disconnect from your personality in a lot of different ways. If you want to hold on to your personality, which is what I try to help people do, is they're going to have to learn to deal with some of the downsides of it.
Yeah, I just know personally when I get into a depressive state, I have to pay really attention to the kinds of things that I'm thinking about, because some of it is just completely negative and just not reality based. But oftentimes there's things that are really valuable messages. I have insights, or I have things that I haven't been dealing with, or things that I've been in denial about, that kind of come rushing up when I'm depressed. And then when I get out of the state, I really need to remember the kinds of insights that I had when I was in the state, because I need to maybe make some changes or talk to somebody about something or deal with things that I haven't been dealing with. And then kind of in a sense, the depression becomes sort of a completing force in my life. It brings in missing parts, and then it helps me to actually have a fuller life and a more creative life. And I know that that's very, very hard. It's not something I would have been able to hear, 6 years ago or five years ago. But I think it's something that I've learned, that these parts of me actually do have value. It's not just like the machine is broken, that there actually is something valuable in the depression experience itself.
Right. I think one of the kind of, I don't know how good this metaphor fits for you here, or this analogy, but I mean, one of the ways of kind of looking at it is sort of like fire. I mean, fire can be this very destructive thing. I mean, but it also fire can cook food. It can create beautiful objects. It can warm you. I mean, it can do all kinds of stuff. And I think part of when people go through these deep funks, these deep periods of malaise, that there's a lot of things that could go on for them that could be unbelievably self-destructive and not helpful to anybody else. But there could be also certain things that emerge during that process that can be very helpful to themselves and other people. One of the things I tell folks is that the parts of surviving America's depression epidemic that where some of the things that people felt, oh, well, these are the most helpful things, I kind of wrote when I was in deep states and deep funks, and kind of hung in there and tried to see how I could kind of use those emotional states to get, as a vehicle to get me to some places. And sometimes they just become nothing more than a funny story. But sometimes they're more difficult. They create even more meaningful events. I mean, you talk about a lot of famous people that when they had their period of change in life, whether it was Malcolm X, or you could go through a whole list of people that they had these deep periods of dark despair, as that led them to a path of what they needed to do. And sometimes those paths were problematic. Some people moved into some really bad, problematic, negative behaviors, but other people moved into unbelievably altruistic and positive, transforming places.
Well, one of the things that I tell people, because I work so much in peer counseling, and people talk to me about their pain and their struggles with suicide and depression. One of the things I tell people is that, look, this is a movie. Your life is a movie, and it hasn't finished yet. This is a book that you haven't read further. And so if you just give up, or you decide to end your life, you're not going to know what happens next. And it's often really worth it to find out what happens next, because our lives are about change. And like you said, some of the most powerful, creative, inspiring, spiritually connected, amazing people have had extremely dark periods of depression. And to sort of see it in a bigger context, that the suffering that you're going through now may be part of something that's going to unfold that may be more amazing and positive than you could ever imagined at some point in the future. You just have to kind of stick around and do what you can. Bruce, we are almost out of time. I wanted to give you a chance to wrap up. Any last words?
I think the last point off of what you're saying is a huge point of surviving America's depression epidemic, is that a major problem of consumer society is to make people feel bad about feeling bad. And that's how you get people to buy more products and more services. And one of the most important rebellions that for people is to embrace, all of their emotionality. And yeah, certainly it feels better to feel joy than to feel sadness. But how you get in trouble out there in life is to buy into kind of society's idea that if you're feeling sad, you're some kind of loser. And once you become alienated from your negative emotions, they win. Totalitarians win. Sort of people who are selling you ridiculous products win. And the more that you can be around people who will certainly enjoy the positive feelings, but not feel alienated from all the human dimensions, you're going to be less in pain. You're going to be less alienated from your feelings, and be actually much less susceptible to severe emotional difficulties.
Bruce Levine, thank you so much for joining us today on Madness Radio. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show and to hear about your really inspiring and amazing work.
My pleasure, Will.
You've been listening to an interview with Bruce Levine. He is a clinical psychologist and author of the recently released book, Surviving America's Depression Epidemic, How to Find Morale, Energy, and a Community in a World Gone Crazy. Highly recommended. Check it out at your independent local bookstore. And you can also take a look at Bruce's website, which is Bruce Levine, Levine, brucelevine.net. That's about all the time we have this week. Thanks a lot for tuning in on Madness Radio. You've been listening to Madness Radio, voices and visions from outside mental health. Madness Radio is broadcast every Wednesday, 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Pacifica affiliate WXOJ-LP-FM 103.3 Valley Free Radio in Northampton, Massachusetts. For our live internet stream, podcasting, show archives, and more, visit madnessradio.net. Madness Radio is co-produced by Freedom Center and the Icarus Project. For more information, check out freedom-center.org and theicarusproject.net. For more mental health radio, listen to the NewsHour from mindfreedom.org, Wednesdays, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you have an idea for a story or guest on Madness Radio, or you just want to share what's in your head, contact us at radio@madnessradio.net.
KWMD Kasilov, 90.7, Anchorage 104.5.